Hello students, today's topic is metaphysical poetry. Myself Divya Meena, assistant professor of Government Girls College, Sikandra. So today we will discuss about the metaphysical poetry. As there are other forms of poetry as Anglo-Saxon poetry, classical poetry, neoclassical poetry, romantic poetry. In the same way, there is a type of poetry which is known as metaphysical poetry. All other poetries, as I have mentioned, belong to some particular age, but metaphysical poetry does not represent any age. It is a particular school of thought. It is poetry about a particular thought, as it was as the highly intellectual thoughts were represented through the metaphysical poetry. If we talk about the word metaphysical, then the meaning of the metaphysical is meta means beyond and physical means this physical world. So the writers who wrote the metaphysical poetry, they wrote beyond this physical world. It means their thoughts which they represented through their poetry were not ordinary. Their thoughts were extraordinary, and also the thoughts were complicated. So it is known as the metaphysical poetry. Mostly the 17th century writers who belong to the 17th century wrote this type of poetry. The age was Jacobean age, which started after the end of the Elizabethan age. The writers belong to the most of the writers who wrote the metaphysical poetry belongs to the Jacobean age. If we talk about the term metaphysical, then the term was coined in 18th century. Actually, the writers who wrote the metaphysical poetry, they themselves did not know that their poetry will be known as metaphysical poetry. Actually, no name was given to their poetry. In 18th century, the term metaphysical was coined by a greatest writer, Samuel Johnson. He wrote a book, and the name of the book was Lives of Most Eminent English Poets. He wrote this book in 18th century. In this book, he mentioned about 52 poets. He wrote about the life and works and achievements of the 52 poets. While writing about them, while writing about the particular writer, Cowley, he mentioned the word metaphysical for the first time. So the writers who wrote the metaphysical poetry, they did not know that they will be known as the metaphysical poets. If we talk about the particular qualities of the metaphysical poetry, it means what is metaphysical poetry, then there are some particular qualities which they mention in their poetry. So first of all, if we talk about the particular metaphysical writers, then the most famous metaphysical writers were John Donne, Andrew Morville, George Herbert, Richard Crashaw, Henry Vaughan, Abraham Covley, Thomas Traherne, John Cleveland, Richard Lees, Edward Bellows. These were the writers who wrote the metaphysical poetry. John Donne was the most famous writer of this particular genre of poetry. If we talk about the qualities of the poetry, then the as the name represent that the ideas which they mention in their poetry, they were beyond this physical world. The ideas were extraordinary and the complicated thoughts were represented through their works. So their poetry was highly intellectual. To show their intelligence was their whole endeavor. They tried to show their intelligence through their works. The ideas were too much witty. They use far-fetched imaginary. It means they use a kind of imaginary which cannot be imaginable by the common or normal peoples. Many similes and metaphors are used in their poetry. They use paradoxes. Paradoxes are the opposite ideas. Two dissimilar things are compared with each other, which are totally dissimilar, and unexpected things are compared with each other. So through this, they try to show their intellectuality through their work. The theme of their poetry was about love, religion, morality. They use conceits. Conceits are known as the comparison of unexpected things. As all these writers used so many conceits, they try to compare two different things or unexpected things with each other. In the 18th century, T.S. Eliot, who wrote an essay about metaphysical poetry, Dryden also wrote about the metaphysical poets. John Donne was the most eminent writers among the metaphysical poets, and he was also known as the monarch of wit. His famous works are Satire, Songs of Sonnets, Holy Sonnets, which were published in 1633. So this is all about the metaphysical poetry. I hope that you will understand through this video all about the metaphysical poetry.